So it's wonderful to be here, and I think it's great. In the United States, there are so many associations. This is the Northwest Creation, the Creation Network, and there's a number of groups around the United States, and I think it's having a great impact on the country in distributing the information, raising awareness, and pushing back against the secularization of our country. And that's why we want to talk about tonight the deluge of evidence, Noah's flood, and the historical roots of secularism. Now, there's a book that I read recently by a guy who lived in India. He was educated in India, and he was trying to raise the community standards as far as economic standards, health standards in his country. And he had a lot of trouble with all sorts of obstacles and issues. And the question occurred to him, when he saw the plight of his own country, the question occurred, why are some nations more successful than others? His name was Vishal Magdawali. And he wrote a book, and the book, the title of it, or the subtitle of it, is How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization. And the title of the book was The Book That Made Your World. And he's writing it really for a Western audience, because in the West we tend to have forgotten the impact that the Bible has had on our culture and which we enjoy day by day. And so Vishal Magdawali said it was the Bible that made the difference. It was the Bible that created the culture. It was the Bible that created the soul and the way of thinking that transformed the West into what the West is and the heritage that we have. And there was something that changed. And this thing that changed was to do with geology, and that's what we wanted to talk about tonight. Now, there's another book I want to mention, and CMI doesn't sell it, but it's a book called The Man Who Found Time. It's a biography of a guy by the name of James Hutton, who was one of the pioneers of modern geology, who brought in the geological philosophy. And in this book, it describes the thinking in the West at the time when James Hutton was developing his theories. And in this book, on page 14, it says, the Scottish Presbyterian Church, the English Anglican Church, and the Lutheran Church, and the Catholic Church, indeed all Christian churches, their clergies and their followers believed that the earth was not even 6,000 years old. A widespread belief in the culture as to the age of the earth. And it goes on to say this belief was a tenet of rigorous analysis of the Bible. So by studying the Bible, they came up with this idea of the age of the earth and other holy scriptures. It was not just the devout. It was not just the clergy and the devout and the Christians who believed this, who embraced this belief. Most men of science agreed that the earth was young. So we see this is the culture, what the culture was like if we're going back some 200 years or so. And indeed, you can see that in the development of geological ideas. One of the early pioneers of geology, Nicholas Steno, lived in the mid-1400s. He wrote a little book called The Prodromus, which means the introduction. And Steno was good at anatomy. And he identified, rightly, one of the puzzles of the time was these odd objects which were in the rocks. And he identified that these were indeed the remains of once living organisms. So he identified the fossils were once alive. He developed the principles of stratigraphy, still taught first year of geology courses in colleges today. And he developed a geological history of the area in which he lived. And it was based on the Bible history. So Nicholas Steno, the father of geology, was a six-day biblical creationist. So that's how it was in Europe. And in fact, if you had one of the early copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica, it had articles about Noah's flood, portrayed it as a real event, about the age of the earth. And so the understanding was that the Bible was true history. And even the Bibles, you know, when you open up your Bible, it would have the dates in the margins there. Right there, you'd have 4004 B.C. at the beginning of Genesis. But you know, something's changed. And we see a totally different culture today. As a matter of fact, we see our culture changing quite rapidly, don't we? And see things which are promoted in the public arena, which a decade or a couple of decades ago you would never imagine would be out there so brazenly promoted. And so what's changed? And really it's described, very well described, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, talking about scoffers. So scoffers is not something that's confined to our culture, to our day and age, but it goes right back. Peter was familiar with them. And he talks about these scoffers, and he said they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens were created and the earth was formed out of water and by water. So what do they forget? They deliberately forget that God created. And then they also forget that by these waters also, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. So they forget about creation that God created. They forget about the flood, the judgment on the earth by water at the time of Noah. And really this forgetting came in, really James Hutton. And I mentioned the biography of his, and he's held up in high esteem in his home country of Scotland and in England. And there's a brochure about him. And what it says, what he said in developing geology, he said, the past history of our globe must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. See, geology is different from many of the other hard sciences like physics and chemistry, in that with geology you can't actually observe something in the lab. You can go out into the field and find rocks and look at rocks and examine them under the microscope, but you can't go and see how they formed because we can't go back in time. So that raises a dilemma. And Hutton, facing that dilemma, said, we have to explain the past by what we see happening now. And of course, we don't see creation in 6 days happening today. We don't see global floods happening today. And so by this particular rule that he made up, you know, before anybody knew anything much about geology, he's actually eliminating creation, removing the flood from any possible explanation of the rocks. And it's just exactly like Peter said. They deliberately forget. And it goes on in this little biography of Hutton. In the jacket, it says, Hutton proved that the earth was likely millions of years old rather than the biblically determined 6,000. So there you got the age of the earth. Straight in, right at the first point, is that there's a conflict between Hutton's ideas and the age of the earth. You see, he didn't actually prove it at all. He imagined it. And because he said, let's use only processes that we can see happening today, that means you have to have long periods of time. And so that's where the idea of millions of years comes from. Now, his ideas are picked up by a guy, a lawyer, by the name of Charles Lyell, and he promoted his ideas, the same sort of philosophy, and in the principles of geology, and the same sort of thing. An attempt to explain the former changes in the Earth's surface, that is what happened in the past, by reference to causes now in operation. So it's exactly the same as Hutton, and he popularized him. And Charles Lyell knew what he was doing. He said, as a matter of fact, his aim was to free geology from Moses. So there we have it, you see. It's the Christian West, the Christian Europe, which has believed the Bible was true. Here these guys are moving in and saying, we want to get the Bible out of it. We don't want anybody to think it's true anymore. And so to free geology from Moses. And a young guy who was traveling on a ship around the world, an amazing voyage for a 22-year-old young man, picked up this book by Lyell, and he's a theological student, actually, training for the ministry. And as a result of reading about geology, he no longer believed the Bible, and he developed his own theories, and his name was Charles Darwin, and he came up with his theory, evolution over millions of years. And that's really what's brought about the secularization of the West. See, if everything came about, if there's no God involved, then we can do what we like. We don't have any constraints, and so we see all sorts of ideas and behaviors being promoted as normal in the West. And from the ideas of Lyell and Hutton and the others, the rocks and the fossils have been classified, and into a chart. Something like this is one way that they're presented, and you can see the various fossils, some of the ones that are deeper in the earth, and then as you move up in the earth, the layers sitting on other layers, and you can see these geological column, and you can see down the side there are various dates which are alongside. Can you see that? Millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. So in these fossils, you know, we've got trilobites, and they first really described in Wales in the UK, and Wales is called Cambria. So these particular rocks they're found in are called Cambrian, 500 plus million years ago over here. And then you've got fish, which are found in rocks found around Devon in England, and they're the Devonian, you know, again, 300 million years ago. And you've got the age of the dinosaurs, 150 million years ago, that sort of thing. And so this philosophy is widespread. So rather than believing Noah's flood happened, rather than believing the world is young, now we've got the idea that the world is millions of years old. It all came about by itself, and there was no God involved. And this is promoted everywhere. Go to the Grand Canyon, there you find the signs paid for by the Department of, you know, Environment, whatever. You know, we're talking about billions of years old, promoted there. And you go to the UK, to the Giant's Causeway, and there you see the presentations, you know, 60 million years ago. If you go to my country, to one of the museums there, you find these skeletons of this dinosaur, which is found at a town near Muttaburra. They called it the Muttaburrasaurus, which is amazing, and it's 100 million years ago. And so you see this issue. This dinosaur, of course, is dead. You know, when you dig up a dinosaur, you're not digging up the past, you're digging up fossils in the present. And it's like hunting, well, how did it get there? And so being dead, you know, 100 million years ago, that's what evolution says, is that death and suffering and disease has been around for millions of years. And as a matter of fact, that's what's led to our existence. Whereas the Bible says, the biblical worldview, is that death came into the world as an enemy as a consequence of mankind's actions. And so we see if the biblical worldview is right, if what the Bible says is right, and of course it is, then we know that that can't be right. And so the issue is to do with the geology is one of the key things. And it's interesting. I just mentioned another little story by a guy called Kenneth, and he's about the significance, how this affects people. Kenneth says, I was raised in the church until my teens, before rejecting it and declaring myself an atheist agnostic. He says, the creation evolution issue was the number one sticking point for me. How could I possibly believe the Bible if it was wrong from the very start? And see that in that little one story, you've got the big story of the secularization of the West. One person at a time is changing their mind and believing that you can't believe the Bible if it's wrong from the very beginning. But you know, things are changing today, and this creation conference is part of the evidence that things are changing. There is a growing awareness that you can trust the Bible through this creation information that's getting out there. And the geology of Noah's flood, there's a resurgence of biblical geologists is bringing the truth of God as creator back into the West. There's a battle going on. It started back in 1961 with the publication of a book, an amazing book called The Genesis Flood by a guy called Whitcomb and Morris. And from that has really been the launch of the modern creation movement, the Genesis Flood. So let's have just a quick look at it, and then we'll look for some at the evidence. See, it starts in Genesis chapter 6. 6, 7, and 8 are three chapters that describe the flood. And so it's always good to start there because that's the only record that we have in our world of what happened. And we read there that God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. And he goes on to say, so build yourself an ark. And so I want to just touch on the size of the ark. I don't know if everybody's familiar with the fact that the Bible describes an ark that's a very, very long vessel. It's some 450 feet long. It's 450 feet long, longer than a football field. It's incredible. It's very high. It's higher than a 4-story building, but it only had 3 decks. had a capacity of some 15,000 tons, and as it sank in the water, it was incredibly stable. So the Bible describes a vessel which is big enough to do what the Bible says it did. So what I'm saying is it's a plausible story, that the details surrounding it fit with our experience. And it's not like a legend or a fairy story where you've got an ark that's like an overgrown bathtub and you've got the animals hanging out of it and it looks like they're on a surfing trip and Mrs. Noah's hanging up the washing on a line. It's not like that at all. It's a very serious, sober description of an event that really happened on the earth. And we read there, the Bible talks about how the animals went on so they would be, each kind would be saved and preserved alive on the earth. And Noah and his wife and their 3 kids and their wives went on. And then it says the door was shut. And then the fountains of the great deep broke open. So that means water came from underneath the windows of heaven. It rained. The water came up on the earth. It continued to rise, lifted up the ark, and it continued to rise until every high mountain under the entire heavens were covered. And we read there that everything that had the breath of life in it perished. Birds and livestock and animals that creep on the surface of the earth. Only those which were with Noah on the ark survived. And they're the ones we see on the world today, except for those that have gone extinct since. And I mentioned the waters rose greatly on the earth. The Bible says, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. So you can see that the Bible is describing a global flood. You can't cover the highest mountains without having it affecting the whole of the world. And so there's lots of evidence for it. So let's have a look at this deluge of evidence for Noah's flood. There's a deluge that it really happened. Well, the first thing is the highest mountain in the world's got marine fossils at the top of it. Mount Everest, 29,000 feet. If those people that have gone up there, and you can go up there too if you've got enough money, and they can't guarantee you'll come back, but most people do. And you go up to the top of Mount Everest. Right up the top there's marine sediments and there's marine fossils at the top of Mount Everest. Of course, Mount Everest didn't exist before the flood. The sediments of that mountain were deposited under the ocean during the flood when the whole world was deluged and destroyed. And then towards the end of the flood, as the crust of the earth moved, it was pushed up. And so we see the evidence. And then there's another evidence, and geologists recognize it, that the world was indeed covered with vast inland seas covering the continents. Quite amazing. Here's a picture, a map that appears on a science website of our national broadcaster in Australia, showing the vast inland sea that covered Australia in the past, during the creation. They even give it a name. It's called the Eromanga Sea. And of course, there were seas that covered North America. And the generic name for these seas is eperic seas, these shallow seas, maybe half a mile to a mile deep across the continents. And even though the geologists see these seas, they map them, they find the evidence for them, they dig out the fossils that were deposited during this time, they don't connect it with Noah's flood. And that's because of the geologic time scale. Because you see, you've got your hundreds of millions of years down there, and the eperic seas existed at the time of the dinosaurs around here, at the time of Cretaceous, and that was 100 million years ago. But of course, there were no people that lived 100 million years ago. According to their thinking, people only evolved in the last couple of million years. And so they imagined people are there, so that's got nothing to do with Noah's flood. So what you need to do is you see that whole idea of millions of years comes from the philosophy of Hutton and Lyell that everything happens slowly. So really, it's not, you don't dig up a fossil which has got a date on it. You don't look at a cutting in an embankment and find that the layers are labelled in dates. Nobody was there with a calendar marking it off. And so they're totally subjective. And so there's a little model which I developed a number of years ago about how to recognise and identify where the rocks fitted that we find on the earth, biblical geology. And when you look at this, very briefly, and I won't go into it tonight, but basically the first thing you have to do is you have to get rid of the dates. And we just look at the evidence. You get rid of the philosophy, get rid of the stuff that's subjective, and just look at the geological evidence. And when you do that, you realize from the evidence that this part of the column is as the floodwaters were rising. So most of the geologic column was deposited as the waters were rising. This part was as the waters were falling, so eroding the continents, and this part was post-flood. Now, there's a little bit of give and take, just exactly where you draw the line, but that's a general sort of picture of where it is. And of course, with Noah's flood, there's one little catchy phrase about what would you expect to find, what would the evidence be, and of course, fossils is one evidence. You know, billions of dead things, which are fossils, buried in rock layers, laid down by water, which is sedimentary rock all over the earth. And so if you go out to Dinosaur National Monument, of course, you'll be able to see some of the billions of dead things there that are buried in the rocks. A veritable dinosaur graveyard. And you can see the various bones and remains of these animals scattered in a heap there, and be able to identify and find there's quite a number of animals together. And when you're digging up dinosaur fossils, you find that they're in a very characteristic pose, Opisthotonic posture, they call it. Dead dinosaur posture is another way of describing it. And as people have analysed this, they've wondered, why in the world are they all so similar in the way they're buried? And they've come to the conclusion that it's likely that they're buried very rapidly. That's one hypothesis. And it's to do with suffocation. Another one is that they were in water, and the various ligaments were changing their length due to the water that was there. And either way, it's consistent with rapid burial during, a catastrophe on the earth. And so there's some of the dead things you find. For example, large shells, ammonites and all sorts of marine shells scattered across the surface of the continents, long way from the ocean. These are some of the ones in Australia, which are found within the sediments, the yellow sediments, which are Cretaceous and Jurassic and Cretaceous, contain the Great Artesian Basin, and these sediments, these fossils were found there. Also in that area, they found amazing remains of sea creatures, like a very large plesiosaur. One of the local farmers on his cattle station, as we call it, would call it a cattle ranch, I suppose, but they call it a cattle station. He discovered the skull poking out of the ground, and these are the paleontologists from the museum. They're digging it up. It's some 12 feet long. It's lying on its back. And they said there must have been some catastrophe here. Why would they think it was a catastrophe? Because if it just died naturally, the sort of processes that we see happening now, like James Hutton says that we need to look at, then it would be eaten by other animals. So it doesn't fit with the idea that things happen slowly and gradually. Even the bones in its flippers are preserved and not far away. So there's a catastrophe involving marine creatures. But there's also nearby land dinosaurs which are found. This one's a ANKYLOSAUR. You can see some of the remains of it. An animal of the land. It's well preserved. Even some of the details in its skin are preserved. And so this catastrophe not only involved the ocean, it also involved the land, which is entirely what you'd expect, consistent with the biblical description of the Noah's flood catastrophe. And this is a model of the ANKYLOSAUR outside one of the little museums in the middle of our country and my state of Queensland. And it's much drier there than it even is in Arizona. But we don't have those amazing cacti that are sticking up like soldiers with their hands surrendering. Anyway, so there's some of the evidence. Now, the idea that things happen slowly and gradually, was something that Charles Darwin held on to as a way to explain why he didn't find the intermediate fossils. And he came up with the idea that no organism wholly soft can be preserved. So therefore, we should have all these missing fossils. That was his idea. But you know what? People find lots and lots of examples of organisms where the soft parts are preserved. Like this guy, James Hagedorn, has found fossil jellyfish, published it in Geology journal. And here it is with the ripple marks and the fossil jellyfish. How long does a jellyfish last before it all sort of rots away to nothing in the sun? Not long at all. So it has to be buried quickly. And these are some of the other pictures which he had published in the journal article where he reported it, showing the various fossil jellyfish which he found. So that's another evidence, rapid burial, evidence of catastrophe. I went up to Nova Scotia and went to the Bay of Fundy, and there where the tides are very high, they go, plus or minus 40 feet in as the waters come in. It erodes away the edges, these cliffs, and as the cliffs fall down, they expose trees that are standing in the cliffs, buried in the cliffs. And the amazing thing is that these trees are sitting there vertically. Some of them are in the cliffs. And when you look at them, you see that they're amazingly preserved. The thickness of the trunk at the bottom is about the same as at the top. And doesn't show any evidence of having been waiting for a long period of time before it was buried by sediment. When I was at Mount St. Helens a few days ago and we saw the various tree trunks sticking out of the ground, we could see that they had rotted quite a bit over the 30 or so years since they were buried. So this is an indication that this sediment was laid down rapidly. And there was a guy by the name of Derek Ager in England who was trained under Charles Lyell's philosophy, who in his career as a geologist discovered lots of evidence that didn't fit with what had been taught at university, because the idea of uniformitarianism or Lyell's ideas were not right. So he pointed to some tree trunks, a drawing. He's got a drawing of them from the coal measures in Wales in the UK. And he says, as he describes them, he says, we cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed. And so it's surprising to somebody who doesn't believe in Noah's flood, but it's not surprising to someone who believes the Bible and the catastrophe that it describes. So this is some of the evidence that really is sort of resisting the secularization of the West, real evidence for the truth of the Bible. If you go to Grand Canyon, and I was there just a few weeks ago, just on the rim, but it's interesting to see the horizontal layers in the canyon. And this is an example of the contact between the Hermit Shale, the dark red below, and the Coconino Sandstone at the top. Now, the interesting thing is, between these two layers, there's supposed to be a time gap of some 6 million years, which is astounding. You'd think that if this stuff was exposed for millions of years, that the surface would not be flat and smooth, that it would be eroded into gorges and gullies and be highly irregular. And so these flat gaps, which are right around the world, but particularly in Grand Canyon, point to the idea that it happened quickly. So here we've got the flat gaps in the Grand Canyon. The one at the top, 6 million years, is between the Hermit Shale and the Coconino Sandstone. The next one down below it is some 14 million years, and still the layers are incredibly flat. And then the one below is 100 million years, and yet the layers still remain incredibly flat. So that's amazing evidence, a deluge of evidence, in fact, that Noah's catastrophe was real, and that what the Bible records is verifiable in the rocks that we see them. Now, in Australia, near our capital city of Sydney, if you go a little bit to the west, a couple of hours' drive, you come into the Blue Mountains, they call it, and there are these rock outcrops. This is in Sydney, and they call them the Three Sisters. You can sort of understand why. There's these three outcrops which are erosional remnants. And I know you have a few different places, geological features in your country which are called the Three Sisters. Well, we've copied your name, or maybe you copied us, I don't know. But here they are, sandstone outcrops. You can see how the sandstone in the foreground extends right into the background. It's a very, very large deposit in what's called the Sydney Basin. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that the flat layer at the top, see how flat it is at the top? Can you see that line? There it is up the top there. This is one of the characteristics, or one of the evidences of Noah's flood. Because the Bible says that the waters rose until every high mountain under the entire heavens were covered. So that meant that every continent was covered in water. And if there's movement, and as the waters recede, that erodes the surface is flat. And particularly as the waters recede and the ocean basins sink and they go down in episodically, you find that these flat layers follow down at different levels. But the flat layers are evidence of the waters covering a large area during the Noah's flood. But then as the waters reduced, then some parts of the landscape would poke above them, and the waters would be confined to wide channels, much wider than we see today. And so here we see the wide channel at the Three Sisters in Sydney, near Sydney. And the river that flows through that valley didn't carve the canyon, but indeed it just flows through it. It was carved by a larger amount of water in the past. Now geologists recognize this, and they describe these valleys as overfit valleys. In fact, the valley is too big for the river, and that's because the river didn't carve it. And then we find at these steep escarpments, we find at the bases of these escarpments that there's very little debris, broken rocks which have fallen down, lying there, and indicating that the canyon, the walls of the canyon were carved recently, and they've not been breaking down slowly and gradually over millions of years. So we see this sort of evidences indeed all around the world. You go to Grand Canyon, see the same sort of thing. You can see the flat surface at the top, right? Those flat surfaces, again, where the whole area was carved flat. And in fact, geologists, they used to refer to it as the Great Denudation, where the whole area was denuded of miles, half a mile or more of sediment from the surface. Then we find the large valleys, which is much larger than the little Colorado River by comparison, flowing down the bottom. And then you find at the edges of the cliffs, you find very little debris down there. Again, a characteristic. There's a guy who wrote an article, a guy from the Netherlands, who wrote an article for a Journal of Creation, and in it he's published or developed a receding flood scenario for the carving of the Grand Canyon. And in it he relied on lots of evidences, and one of the evidences that he referred to was Google Earth. And in Google Earth, you can actually sort of see the wide area, the wide channel that the waters flowed out at one stage as the waters were receding. And so they were flowing out, carving a wide valley. And if you look at the cross-section of the canyon, you can see, first of all, the horizontal layers at the top, where there was covering a large area. You can see the wide valley, where they've reduced in flow, but still enormous. And then at the edges of these escarpments, you can see that there's very little debris at the bottom. And so this guy, Derek Ager, as he followed his geological career and continued to find evidences that didn't fit with the philosophy that he was taught at his college, he wrote a book called The Nature of the Stratigraphical Record. He wrote a couple of books, but this is one of them. And he says, we have allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme or what might be termed catastrophic processes. And indeed that was the case, that for 150 years, basically, geologists it was not good, it was not really proper to be able to refer to a catastrophic process. You had to try to find a way of explaining it using slow and gradual processes. You know, one of the things that happens in our ministry, in Creation Ministry, is people send us samples, things they find. And one family sent us a little rock that they found on the beach in Brisbane. And I put it out at our building and we photographed it. It's quite a cute little rock. Can you see that? It's a sandstone, it's a light colour. And there it is, we've got it. And so you look at this rock, they found it on the beach and they thought I'd be interested in it. And the reason why is because when you turn the rock over, it actually is encasing a little model car. And so when they saw it on the beach, they just assumed that it was there and had been there, you know, for time immemorial. And yet when they picked it up and looked at it underneath, they saw that it was only recent. And that's one of the things that happens, is there's so many things in our culture which are presented to us that give us the impression that we just think are millions of years old, that really, really old. And in actual fact, they're not old at all. You know, one of the things that people get the impression of vast ages is with opals. And Australia, of course, is famous for its opal fields. And people go out into dig around in the dirt and burrow under the ground and find these opals. And we've got a large part of the market. And it says that the opals are millions of years in the making. And yet one of the guys on the opal field, his name is Len Cram, figured out how to make them in little jars. And they're Vegemite jars. I don't know if you've heard of that term. They're Vegemite jars, and he, of course, enjoyed it, and he's eaten all the Vegemite. And he put in the material, the sand, the sediment, he put in a liquid, and he says within about 10 days, the opal colouring appears. It's still a bit like a gel, but the mineral structure is exactly the same as the opal structure. Now, I just want to go on to a little into the UK now and have a look there at a place called the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland. You might be familiar with it. And it's a volcanic lava flow, and the lava is broken into little hexagonal pieces, and it looks like a pavement. And we did an article on this in our Creation magazine, because in Northern Ireland at the Giant's Causeway, it's a World Heritage Site, and what happened in 2000, the visitor centre burnt down. And so some of the Christians in Northern Ireland were wanting to get ammunition to talk to the politicians so there could be a creation explanation at the visitor centre. So we helped them by writing articles and providing information and lobbying the place. Now, the Giant's Causeway, it's got lots of amazing features, like this is the organ. I think you can understand why. Columns of basalt, it's called columnar basalt, and it's got this broken stuff at the top. It's very high. It must be some maybe 300 feet high, 150 feet high, something like that. It's quite high. And the way it forms, it's to do with a volcanic lava flow. It's a black lava called basalt, and so this represents one lava flow. Could be 300 feet thick. And what happens, the way it's sort of envisaged that it forms, is that the molten lava then crystallizes and turns into, solidifies, and as it cools then, it contracts, because it's really, really hot, and as it contracts, it cracks. And so cooling causes it to crack, so the bottom part, it cracks in vertical columns, very amazing looking, and the top part is all random and broken, and they call it, the bottom part they call the colonnade, the top part they call the entablature. It's named after Greek architecture. And so so you can get an idea for the size of the lava flow. When you look at the Giant's Causeway, this is one of the escarpments, one of the cliffs, you can see that this represents one lava flow. So there's a lot of lava that was flowing across the area, and this represents another one. And each one is about 300 feet high, and then you can see in between there's this reddish bed, a slightly reddy colour that's it's called the interbasaltic bed, and that's there. So it's not quite fitting all on, but anyway, that's about where it is. And these lava covers a huge area. So what we're talking about is a big catastrophe with lots of lava, lots of eruptions, huge volumes of material. And the other thing is that the Creation magazine, we did an article about this interbasaltic bed, because in the information or the literature that's handed out at Giant's Causeway, they say that this was a soil that was developed over millions of years. And so we did this article to show that in fact it was not a soil, that it was deposited rapidly, and it contains lots of vegetation, and not it was formed rapidly. So we put this information up, published a brochure about it, and this was widely distributed in Northern Ireland, and then there's a little diagram showing how it formed. And finally, after 12 years, there was a new visitor centre published. But you know, there are a lot of geologists in Northern Ireland who were not happy with us producing the information. And as a matter of fact, here's one guy to do with the geoscientists of the Geological Society of London. They were calling for censorship. And they said that the young Earth creationists' view of Earth history is based upon a literal interpretation of the Bible is quite simply wrong. See the battle that's going on against the secularization. It's a manifest untruth. Well, who would care if there is no God? Who cares whether it's true or not? It's only when... So they're appealing to Christian morality to be able to fight against the Bible. The creationist views should not be given space in publicly funded museums or visitor centres or in school science lessons or science textbooks. In other words, everybody's got to pay tax, but you can't have your say. What do they call it? No taxation without representation. I've heard of that before, haven't you? Anyway, finally, the visitor centre was built and it was opened in July 2012, and you can see that it's very well designed, and the outside of it's made to look like basalt columns. They even featured some of the mythological characters there, Finn McCool and Benandonner, the Northern Ireland giant and the Scottish giant who used to walk across this causeway. That was the idea of it. And the people who produced it, the National Trust, they said, in this exhibition, we also acknowledge that for some people, this debate continues today. And we reflect and respect the fact that creationists today have a different perspective on the age of the earth than that of mainstream scientists. Well, that's fair enough, isn't it? That's just a fact. Creationists do have a different view. And you know, it wasn't as if there's a great big sign in the visitor centre. As you walked in the door, paid your money, there it was. It was an audio, and you had to pick up the earphones, put them on, and there's a little 20-second bit in the middle of a big audio where this is spoken. So most people would never even know it was on. But the outrage that somebody should say that in a publicly funded visitor centre. Professor Richard Dawkins said it was regrettable that the Trust had paid lip service to the ignorant bigotry of fundamentalists who believe the world is just 6,000 years old. One thing I like about Richard Dawkins is the sense of British politeness and that, the way he speaks, don't you? You know, such graciousness. And he goes on, the National Trust should not have given any consideration whatsoever to the intellectual baboons of young Earth creationism. It raised quite a stir. They were calling for the sacking of the National Trust and all this sort of thing. And this is the latest sort of upcoming TV star, Professor Brian Cox, a physicist, and he says the National Trust should be ashamed of themselves. It could, I don't mind if creation stories, what's it say? I don't mind creation stories presented as mythology, but to suggest there is any debate that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old is pure expletive deleted. And so that was his comment on it. And you know, people were asked in the various TV and various websites about whether it should be taught, and a lot of people said, yes, teach it. You know, here's a survey of News Poll. Yes, 48.8% said yes, we should have it there, and there's a slightly more said no, we shouldn't, and not many said we don't know. And because there was such an overwhelming support for teaching it, somebody hacked into the site and took it down, so because they didn't like that particular poll. So what happened was the National Trust actually pulled the audio. They pulled it out and no longer played it, and said they was going to review the whole thing. And so that allowed the heat to go out of the issue. You wouldn't think it would be so emotional, would you? But you see, it's to do with secularism. It's to do with the way we live our lives, and it's to do whether God is in control, whether he's real or not. And anyway, the National Trust came back about 3 or 4 months later, and they redid the audio. And it was basically very similar to what they said in the first audio. They changed it a little bit, but basically had the same story. And it goes on to say that there are some people who believe, often for religious reasons, that the earth was formed more recently, thousands of years ago, rather than billions. And I thought that was pretty cool to actually get that there. I mean, that was a big fight to be able to get 20 seconds of audio into it. And that's the sort of thing that we're faced in the West today. And that's part of what this the Creation Network's about. It's interesting that it says often for religious reasons. If it's often for religious reasons, that means it's sometimes for other reasons. And sometimes some people, think that it's true. It's not just a religion, but it's based on the scientific evidence. And so you see, there was a commemoration of Charles Lyell's book, and there's various articles in the secular literature. And this guy, Professor Warren Armand, he wrote in, I think it's in Science magazine, is it? Science in 1993. He says this, I'll have to read it. He said, Lyell also sold Geology some snake oil. Well, this is in a prestigious science magazine. It's not some creationist saying this. He convinced geologists that all past processes acted at exactly or essentially their current rates. That is, those observed in historical time. He goes on to say, this extreme gradualism has led to numerous unfortunate consequences. So what could be unfortunate? The problem is the rejection of sudden or catastrophic events in the face of positive evidence for them, for no reason other than they were not gradual. So are geologists biased? They wouldn't like you calling them biased, but here's a geologist, a professor of geology in a scientific magazine, saying the geologists, it was unfortunately, but they rejected the obvious explanation because they didn't like it, because it was not gradual. And so you see this issue of there's an abundance of evidence, and we've touched on a little bit of it, and we're going to do a little bit more through this conference, looking at some really cool things. But this issue, as I said, is something that affects people one by one. And so they can be taken away from their faith in the Bible, their heritage in the church, because of this secular philosophy. Like this young fellow here. His name is Robert. He says, a few months ago, I started on my high school geology course, and my faith was weakened by the evolutionary arguments presented in it. And that's exactly what's happened. That's the secularization of the West. My faith was weakened by the evolutionary arguments presented in it. But he goes on to say, that's why he wrote us the email. He said, a few months later, I received quite a number of your books for Christmas. He said, I must say that these books, as well as this website, have greatly strengthened my faith. And that's what it's all about, information and knowledge. The Bible says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. And this guy, I don't know who bought this guy the books. Was it his father? Was it his grandfather, an uncle? I don't know, but somebody was aware that he was, vulnerable. He was vulnerable. And they provided the information. He says, I must say that these books, as well as this website, have greatly strengthened my faith. And we can multiply the stories. This guy, Jason, just recently we received an email from him. He says, I've battled doubt in my faith life for a long time. And most of it comes from evolution and dinosaurs and scientific stuff. I have found your website most useful. And so I just want to encourage you to make sure you avail yourselves of the books and the DVDs and the information, because you see, the earth is the Lord's. He's the one who made it. Psalm 24 verse 1 and 2 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, because he founded it upon the seas and he established it upon the waters. So when we see the evidence, the geological evidence around about, and we understand how the Bible explains it, it strengthens our faith. It was a geological philosophy that's brought the secularization process into the West, and it's going to be a resurgence of biblical geology that's going to push against it and drive it out. So I just hope that every one of us can be part of the great battle that's going on, and we'll see some really good things happen. Thank you very much.